First things first, if you like this sort of content, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps. I'm currently trying to grow this channel, and the YouTube algorithm really likes all these sort of things. Now, the first thing to tell you would be that Greeks had no direct word for religion. The word religion comes from the Latin religio, which is sort of a devotion to the correct rites and ways of worshipping a god. Instead, Greeks would have referred to eusebia and triskia, meaning in turn piety and cult. Now, you'd be able to display your piety to the gods by adherence to customs such as sacrifice, rituals, processions, and festivals. However, none of these were static, and they were developed over time and would vary from region to region. For instance, the god Asclepius and Tai Chi in English, um, they developed well into the Hellenistic period. Now, in ancient Greek, the word cult had none of the negative connotations that we associate with it today. Instead, every god would have their own cult, pretty much, and this was just a way of worshipping them. So aside from the 12 Olympians, there were many other popular cults. Most popular, I guess, Heracles, Asclepius, Hades had his own. Pan became quite popular during the classical period. And in the Hellenistic period, there were many other cults which spread around the new sort of globalized Hellenistic world that existed. The most popular is actually the Elysian Mysteries, which was practiced near Athens. It's quite an exciting mystery cult that hopefully I'll get to do a video another time on. Some of you may find it quite surprising to find out how much of ancient Greek religion still survives and is relevant today. So we still have the symbol of Asclepius. He was the god of healing. It's still associated with the medical profession today, as we can see on screen at the moment. The scepter and snake are still very popular associations with medicine. There's also a certain amount of evidence to suggest that that some Christian saints are actually derived from ancient Greek minor deities and hero cults. For instance, Hermes, he was the ancient Greek god of travelers, or was one of his jobs anyway, and he's commonly associated with St. Christopher. So the ancient Greeks had no actual formal sacred books, but they did have some codified mythology in the form of Hesiod, which explained the origin myths of many of the Greek gods, and in Homer, which introduces several of the heroes and their subsequent cults. Their priests were not coordinated, and they just look after their own cult, so in this aspect they're very different to the Christian religion. They were also not as dogmatic as medieval Christians and early Christians were, and myths and religion were subject to some criticism, especially in the classical period with the rise of the sophists. However, there were limits on this, and obviously Socrates was killed partly because of his impiety. The word nomoi in ancient Greek refers to both laws and customs, and so in that we can see there is a synonymity between the two, and that would have included the religious customs. For there were consequences to not observing particular rites, as they thought you were putting the whole community at risk. The Greek religion began to form around 2000 BC from the indigenous beliefs of the Pelasgi people and the indo-European newcomers who arrived in what was known as the Dorian invasion. The indo-European pantheon was headed by the supreme sky god known as Deus, who would later become Zeus. It was his influence that explains why the home of the gods is on Mount Olympus, as they literally have a home in the clouds. This pantheon would then mingle with local deities and heroes. For instance, Zeus took a second wife in Hera. Incidentally, Zeus was already married to Metis at this time, and polygamy was not commonly practiced in Greece, so we can assume this was an outside import. Some modern scholars suggest that Hera and Demeter would have been indigenous gods, as they were the gods of fertility, and as agriculturalists, these would have been more appealing to them and more likely to be worshipped, whereas the Indo-Europeans were nomadic. But I'm not really sure whether this distinction's accurate, as surely they both would have needed fertility, both from their animals, the land, and from themselves. And perhaps the fact that these gods' roles overlap shows some of the mingling of the two pantheons. So how would one actually worship a god? So the first thing to do would be to actually pick a god. So each god had their own particular wheelhouse. Some gods had many wheelhouses, and as such, they would be broken up into slightly separate deities. For instance, there would be a Zeus Agorius, who would punish dishonest traders as his role as a keeper of the marketplace. There was also a Phoebus Apollo. This would mean bright, and it signifies his role as the god of light. Many gods also had specific festivals and cult practices, which we can talk about in a separate video. However, there were some rituals that were ubiquitous, not differing from region to region, and we'll go over some of these rituals now. For instance, sacrifice was a common practice. This happened both at festivals and at times of dire need, or just to show your own individual piety. You could do it separately. For instance, before the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians promised Athena that for every dead Persian, they would sacrifice her a goat. However, after killing over 6,000 Persians, they had to negotiate to pay their debt to Athena in installments. Now, any animal could be used to perform a sacrifice. However, the increased value of an animal indicated the greater piety or greater need of the god assistance. Also, some particular gods had their own preferred animals. For instance, Artemis has a preference for stags. In order for the sacrifice to be performed, an animal would be cleaned, dressed in ribbons, and then led in a procession to the altar, with which everyone would take part in. The altar would be outside the front of the temple, within view of the statue of the god inside, but not inside the temple. Barley seeds would be thrown into the animal's path by bystanders, and water would be poured onto the head of the animal, which would cause it to nod as though accepting the sacrifice. A knife was then brought from out of the view of the animal, and the animal's throat would be cut before the animal had a chance to see it. If the animal had seen the knife and had become spooked, this would be a very bad portent. After the animal's throat was slit, the blood would be collected in a bowl, at which point, and after that, the entrails would be inspected with particular attention to the liver. If these were free from disease or defect, then the gods had accepted the sacrifice. The animal would then be cooked and the meat distributed to all in attendance. Due to the low meat diet of the people at the time, this would often induce much indigestion. Gods would then receive the bones of the meat along with the fat and spices and occasionally wine. These would be transmitted to the gods via burning, with the smoke rising, taking the offering to them. Sometimes this smoke could be interpreted for signs of good omens. Animals were not the only thing that could be offered, however. Sometimes incense was used. Sometimes you could make cash or other valuable object offerings, such as a sword, a shield, or a helmet, be offered to the temple. I guess these are a form of sacrifice in themselves. Another common practice of offering was a libation, which is essentially the pouring of a liquid, usually wine, but also honey, milk, olive oil, or even water in some circumstances. And this was the most common sort of offering, and it was performed daily in some instances, usually in the morning and evening, and at meal times. And it was usually accompanied by some sort of prayer. Libations were usually either poured into a fire or into the ground. It is thought that pouring into the ground was to honour those who were dead in the underworld. In the Odyssey, Odysseus makes one such libation, in which he digs a hole, and around the hole he pours honey, water, and wine. Libations were often performed at tombs, temples, and other sacred sites. They were also customary at symposiums. You're supposed to have 3 separate libations. The first to the Olympians, or to the Agathos Daimon, which is the sort of personal spirit, which is rather complicated and we won't go into now. The second would be poured to heroes of Greek myths, and the third would go to Hermes. One of the lesser known rituals was known as the pharmakos, as this is often thought to be a hangover from the days of human sacrifice. Certain cities performed this regularly, apparently, such as in Athens, which involved a ritualistic beating of a criminal, or if they didn't have any criminals, they would pick 2 of the ugliest men they could find. There were other cities that reserved this sort of ritual for a disaster. One account reports that a criminal was attached with feathers and then thrown from a cliff before being picked up by some men in a boat and taken to the shore. This is a strange sort of atonement for his crime, and I've included it in it for comic value, although it seems rather silly and elaborate. At weddings, there were also several rituals that were customary. Along with offerings and sacrifices, there was also a bath of purification for the woman. Weddings were also most often performed at dusk, either to avoid the heat of the day or just for the pure romance of a Greek night sky. The bride would be escorted by a chariot if the cost was not prohibitive, or by horse or donkey otherwise. This procession would go through the streets of the city to the groom's house. An apple would be ritualistically offered from the family of the groom, and this would be consumed by the bride. The process was formalized after a feast, when a dowry was exchanged, and then the bride would move into the house of the groom, which would finalize the deal. Another very important aspect of religion was funeral rites, as if someone did not have the correct funeral, then they would not pass on into the afterlife. Now, after death, the body would be washed and anointed with an oil, and a wreath would be placed around the neck. Coins were then placed over the eyes or in the mouth, and it is thought this would pay the ferryman to cross the Styx into the underworld. After a day of resting, the body would then be laid out for display and visited by friends and family, while the female family members would perform ritual wailing and pulling at their clothes and hair. On the third day, the body would be led in a procession and then be laid to rest. Sometimes this was a burial, however, cremations were popular, particularly in the city of Athens. Mourners would cut pieces of their hair and throw them in with the body, and also libations would be performed in offering. However, offerings would not stop at the day of the funeral. You would continue to offer sacrifices and libations, not just to the recently dead ancestors and friends, but also to your longer lost ancestors, some who you may never have met. And for those who had died in war, they would also get their own procession in their honor, such as the funeral procession in Athens, which was famously politicized by Pericles. I'd like to cover more specific cults, and particularly the mystery cults, in later videos. So please stay tuned and subscribe for that, and let me know if there's any in particular that you'd like to hear.